I learned very early that silence can be louder than shouting. That night, the silence on my street felt heavy, like the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for something ugly to happen. I didn't know yet that a single phone call from my neighbors would crack my life open in ways I couldn't undo. All I knew was that I was tired. It had been a long day, one of those days where nothing goes wrong exactly, but everything feels heavy. The kind of day that sits on your shoulders and refuses to move. I had stayed late at the office, finished paperwork I didn't need to finish, answered emails that could have waited until morning. Not because I was ambitious, but because I didn't want to go home yet. Home had started to feel like a place I had to defend. I turned onto my street just as the sun was beginning to set. The sky was painted in soft purples and oranges, the kind of beautiful that feels almost unfair when you're not in the mood to appreciate it. This was supposed to be a quiet, safe neighborhood. Tree-lined sidewalks, manicured lawns, expensive cars parked neatly in driveways, houses so large they didn't feel like homes, they felt like statements. I had moved here 6 months ago, and in 6 months I had learned exactly how visible I was. I pulled my car into my driveway and turned off the engine. For a moment I just sat there, hands resting on the steering wheel, listening to the ticking sound of cooling metal. That's when I noticed the curtains. Across the street, Mrs. Langley's living room curtains shifted slightly, not enough to look obvious, but enough that I noticed. I always noticed. I stepped out of the car slowly, grabbed my briefcase, and locked the door. The sound echoed more loudly than it should have. I nodded politely toward the house across the street, even though I couldn't see her face. Old habit. My mother raised me to be respectful, even when respect isn't returned. As I walked toward my front door, I felt it again, that sensation. The one that tells you you're being watched. I didn't turn around this time. I was done shrinking myself for people who refused to see me as human. Inside, the house was quiet, too quiet. I set my briefcase down, loosened my tie, and leaned my forehead against the door for just a second. Almost through the day, I whispered to myself. I had no idea the day wasn't done with me yet. I changed into comfortable clothes and stepped outside again, this time to take the trash to the curb. The sky had darkened, the streetlights flickering on one by one, bathing everything in a pale yellow glow. That's when I heard it, a car door slam, then another, then voices, low, urgent, not meant to be heard but loud enough to carry. I glanced down the street and saw a police cruiser slowly turning the corner. My stomach tightened instantly. The lights weren't on yet, but something told me they would be. The car rolled to a stop in front of my house. In front of my house. Red and blue lights exploded into the evening, washing over the neatly trimmed lawns, the white fences, the quiet homes. Neighbors stepped outside almost immediately. Doors opened, porch lights flicked on. People gathered in small clusters, whispering to each other like this was entertainment instead of someone's life. My life. I stood frozen beside my trash can, the lid still in my hand. The police car door opened. An officer stepped out, resting his hand casually on his belt. "Sir," he called out, voice firm but not loud, "can you step over here?" Every eye on the street turned toward me. I felt it then, the familiar heat creeping up my neck, the tightening in my chest, the silent calculation running through my mind. Stay calm, don't move too fast, don't argue, don't give them a reason. "I live here," I said, keeping my voice steady as I walked toward them. The officer's eyes scanned me from head to toe, not aggressively, but not warmly either. "We received a call," he said. "A call," I repeated. "Yes," he replied, "about a suspicious individual." Suspicious. The word hung in the air like an accusation. I looked around at the neighbors now openly watching. Mrs. Langley stood on her porch, arms crossed tightly over her chest. Mr. Hollis stood beside her, shaking his head slowly like he was disappointed in me. Disappointed in what? Existing. I swallowed hard. "I'm not suspicious," I said carefully. "I'm just taking out my trash." The officer nodded slightly, but his posture didn't relax. "Can I see some ID?" My heart sank. I reached into my pocket slowly and handed it to him. He studied it longer than necessary. "You just moved in?" he asked. "Yes." "Renting or owning?" I hesitated. "Own." That got a reaction, a small one, but I saw it. His eyebrows lifted just a fraction. Behind him, another officer had stepped out of the car. My neighbors whispered louder now. I caught fragments. Doesn't look like. I thought this was a safe area. I knew something was off. My hands curled into fists at my sides. This wasn't about safety. This was about comfort, and my presence made them uncomfortable. Sir, the first officer said, handing my ID back, the caller said you were attempting to break into a home. I laughed. I couldn't help it. It came out short and bitter. This is my home, I said, my voice shaking despite my effort. I've lived here for 6 months. The officer looked toward my house, then back at me. Do you have proof? That question hit harder than I expected. Proof of belonging, of ownership, of my right to exist here. I turned toward my house, walked inside, and returned with a folder I never thought I'd need to defend myself with: mortgage papers, utility bills, documents that spelled out my name and address in black ink. I handed them over. The officer reviewed them, his expression shifting slightly. Behind him, the neighbors went quiet, the kind of quiet that comes when people realize they might be wrong but don't want to admit it. I apologize for the inconvenience, the officer said finally. Inconvenience, that was the word he chose, not humiliation, not fear, not public shame, just inconvenience. He handed the papers back. We'll be on our way. The lights turned off. The officers got back into their car just like that. No apology from my neighbors, no acknowledgement, no shame. They simply turned and went back inside their homes, doors closed, curtains drawn, as if nothing had happened. I stood alone under the streetlight, my heart pounding, my hands trembling. That's when I realized something terrifying. This wouldn't be the last time, because they still didn't know who I was, and when they did, everything would change. The police car disappeared down the street, but the feeling it left behind stayed. I stood there for a long time after everyone went back inside. The trash can was still open. The streetlight hummed above me like it was tired of witnessing things it couldn't change. I kept waiting for someone to come back out. Mrs. Langley, Mr. Hollies, anyone, just one person to say, "I'm sorry." No one did. I took the trash back up the driveway and went inside, locking the door behind me with more force than necessary. The sound echoed through the house, too loud in the silence. I leaned against the door again, just like I had earlier, but this time my legs felt weak. It was always like this, not dramatic, not violent, just small moments stacked on top of each other until breathing felt like work. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. My hands were shaking so badly that some of it spilled over the rim. I wiped it with a towel and stared at the dark countertop. I had done everything right. That's what hurt the most. I had gone to school. Gotten the degrees, worn the suit, lowered my voice, smiled when it wasn't deserved, bought the house. I had checked every box they said would make me safe, and still a phone call had been enough to turn me into a threat. I sat at the kitchen table and tried to slow my breathing. In through the nose, out through the mouth. My father used to teach me that. Control your body, he'd say, even when the world doesn't want to control itself. I hadn't thought about him in a while. That night he came back to me in fragments. I remembered being 12 years old, standing in the front yard of our old house, holding a basketball. A police cruiser had slowed as it passed. I remembered the way my father's hand landed gently but firmly on my shoulder. "Come inside," he'd said quietly. "Why?" I asked. "Because," he replied, not looking at the car, "we don't need to explain ourselves today." Back then I thought he was being overly cautious. Now I knew better. That night sleep refused to come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the flashing lights again, heard the word suspicious, felt the weight of my neighbor's stares pressing down on my chest. Around 2 a.m. my phone buzzed, a text from my sister. "You okay?" I stared at the screen. I hadn't told her what happened, but somehow she knew. "Yeah," I typed back, "just tired." The lie tasted familiar. The next morning the neighborhood looked exactly the same, perfect, clean sidewalks, freshly watered lawns. Birds chirping like nothing had happened. That was the cruelest part. Injustice doesn't always leave marks you can point to. Sometimes it just settles into the air and pretends it belongs there. I stepped outside to grab my mail. Mrs. Langley was already out, trimming her hedges. She looked up when she saw me. Our eyes met. For half a second, something crossed her face. Guilt, fear, defensiveness. Then it disappeared. "Morning," she said casually, like she hadn't watched me get questioned by police the night before. Morning, I replied. My voice was steady. I was proud of that, at least. She went back to her hedges. That was it. No apology, no explanation, no acknowledgement, just silence repackaged as politeness. As I walked back inside, something in me hardened, not anger, resolve. I couldn't keep pretending this didn't matter. At work, things weren't much better. I worked in a downtown firm where diversity was celebrated loudly in brochures on websites during meetings. In practice, it was quieter. I sat through a morning meeting where my ideas were repeated by someone else and received better. I smiled when a colleague joked about sketchy neighborhoods without realizing I had grown up in one. I nodded as my boss praised my calm demeanor. You're so articulate, so professional, so non-threatening. Every compliment felt like a condition. By lunchtime, my chest felt tight again. I stepped outside and sat on a bench, staring at my phone. Another message buzzed in, this one from an unknown number. This is Officer Reynolds, just following up. Everything okay today? I stared at the message for a long time. Follow up, as if last night had been a customer service issue. Yes, I typed back eventually. Everything's fine. I put the phone away and laughed under my breath. Nothing was fine. That evening, I drove home slowly. As I turned onto my street, I noticed something new. A neighborhood watch sign had been placed at the entrance, bright, bold, official looking. My jaw tightened. I parked and got out, staring at the sign like it might speak back to me. Neighborhood watch, watching who, watching what? I knew the answer. Inside, I paced the living room, my thoughts spiraling. I could move, sell the house, find somewhere else, somewhere quieter. But why should I? Why was the burden always on me to disappear? I stopped pacing and looked at the framed photo on the wall. It was from my graduation. My mother was standing beside me, smiling so hard her eyes had nearly disappeared. You did it, she'd said that day, her voice trembling. You made it. I had believed her. I still wanted to. Later that night, there was a knock at the door, sharp, unexpected. My body reacted before my mind could, heart racing, muscles tense. I took a breath and opened it. Mr. Holly stood there. He shifted his weight awkwardly. Evening, he said. Evening, I replied, keeping the chain on. He cleared his throat. Look, about last night, I waited. He sighed. We didn't mean any trouble, you understand. These days, you can't be too careful. There it was. I stared at him, disbelief washing over me. Careful about what? I asked quietly. He hesitated. About things, that was all I needed to hear. I was taking out my trash, I said, on my own property. He nodded quickly. Right, no harm done then. No harm. I felt something inside me snap, not loudly but cleanly. There was harm, I said. You just didn't feel it. He frowned, uncomfortable. Well, he muttered, just wanted to clear the air. He turned to leave. I closed the door gently, locked it, and leaned against it one more time. But this time I wasn't trying to steady myself. I was deciding something. They thought they had embarrassed me. They thought they had reminded me of my place. They were wrong. Because they still didn't know who I was, and soon they would. The next few days passed in a strange kind of quiet, not peaceful, not normal, watchful. Every time I stepped outside, I felt it, the pause in conversation, the way curtains twitched, the sudden interest people developed in their phones or lawns when I walked by. They weren't staring openly anymore. They were studying, as if trying to figure me out. I went about my routine anyway, morning jogs, work, groceries, evening walks. I refused to disappear, but I adjusted. I wore brighter clothes when I went out, not because I wanted attention, but because I didn't want excuses. I waved first. I smiled first. I said hello even when it wasn't returned. Respectability as armor, it was exhausting. One afternoon, as I pulled into my driveway, I noticed a car parked across the street that didn't belong to anyone in the neighborhood. Dark sedan, tinted windows, engine idling. It stayed there for nearly 20 minutes. I watched from my porch, pretending to scroll through my phone while my instincts screamed. Finally, the car drove away. That night, I checked my security cameras twice before bed. I hated that I had started doing that. At work, something shifted too. My boss called me into his office late Thursday afternoon. Close the door, he said, smiling too tightly. I did. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. I heard there was an incident at your residence, he said carefully. I didn't answer right away. How did you hear that? I asked. He cleared his throat. Well, you know how people talk. One of the partners lives not far from you. Of course he did. I was falsely reported to the police, I said plainly. He nodded slowly. Of course, just be mindful. We like to keep things quiet. Quiet, that word again. As professionals, he continued, we don't want unnecessary attention. I met his eyes. The police were called on me for taking out my trash, I said. If that's attention, I didn't ask for it. He smiled again, thinner this time. Just focus on your work, he said. I left his office knowing exactly what he meant. Don't make waves, don't talk about it, don't remind anyone that this happened, especially not me. Friday evening arrived heavy and humid. I decided to walk instead of drive to clear my head. As I turned the corner near the cul-de-sac, I heard raised voices. Mrs. Langley, Mr. Hollies, two other neighbors I didn't know well. They stopped talking when they saw me. An awkward silence fell. Oh, hi, Mrs. Langley said, forcing a smile. Hi, I replied. Mr. Hollies cleared his throat. We were just discussing the upcoming HOA meeting, he said. Really, I asked. Didn't know we had one. Mrs. Langley's smile tightened. It was scheduled last minute. Of course it was. What's on the agenda? I asked calmly. She hesitated. Safety, she said. I nodded slowly. Whose? I asked. No one answered. That told me everything. The HOA meeting was the following Tuesday. I almost didn't go but something in me refused to let decisions about me be made in rooms I wasn't allowed into. The meeting was held at the community clubhouse, modern, spotless, intimidating in its own subtle way. When I walked in, conversations stopped. Every chair but one was taken. The empty one was in the back. I sat in it anyway. The HOA president, a man named Carl who loved procedure more than people, cleared his throat. Let's begin, he said. The discussion started innocently enough. Landscaping, parking rules, noise complaints. Then Mrs. Langley raised her hand. I think we need to address recent concerns, she said. My pulse quickened. Carl nodded. Go ahead. Well, she continued, choosing her words carefully, some of us feel that there have been unfamiliar activities happening in the neighborhood. I felt every eye drift toward me. I didn't look away. She glanced at me briefly, then back at Carl. We just want to ensure everyone here belongs, she said. Belongs. I stood up. The room stiffened. I belong, I said clearly. Murmurs rippled through the room. I own my home, I continued. I pay my taxes, I follow the rules, and last week someone here decided that wasn't enough. Mrs. Langley's face flushed. This isn't about race, she said quickly. Of course she did. It never is, I replied. Carl shifted uncomfortably. Let's keep things civil, he said. I am being civil, I said, but I'm also being honest. Silence. Then a woman near the front spoke up. Well, if there was nothing to hide, the police wouldn't have been called. Something in me went very still. That's not how justice works, I said quietly. That's how fear works. No one responded. The meeting ended shortly after. As people filed out, they avoided my eyes, except one man. He approached me slowly, extending his hand. My name's Daniel, he said. I didn't agree with what happened. I shook his hand. Thank you, I said. It was the first time anyone had said that. That night I sat at my desk and opened my laptop. I hadn't planned to do this yet, but the moment had arrived. I pulled up a folder I kept encrypted, not because it was illegal, but because it was powerful. Documents, names, dates, records. I stared at the screen, my reflection faintly visible in the glass. I thought about my father, about my mother, about the 12-year-old boy pulled inside so he wouldn't be seen as a threat. I thought about how carefully I had lived and how little it had protected me. I took a deep breath. They thought they had called the police on a nobody. They thought they had embarrassed a man with nothing to lose. They were wrong because I wasn't just a homeowner. I wasn't just an employee. I was the man their city depended on, even if they didn't know it yet, and very soon they would. I didn't sleep much that night, not because I was afraid, but because my mind was finally clear. There's a difference between fear and readiness. For weeks, maybe months, I had been absorbing everything, telling myself patience was strength, that silence was maturity. But silence had only taught them one thing, that I would endure quietly. I closed the laptop and stared out the window at the street I once believed I had earned my place on. Tomorrow, I decided I would stop explaining myself. The shift began the next morning. It was subtle at first. My phone rang before I left for work, an unfamiliar number. "This is City Legal Affairs," the woman on the other end said. "We're confirming your availability for a scheduled briefing this afternoon." I paused. "Yes," I replied, "I'll be there." At work, the atmosphere felt different. People were careful. My boss stopped by my desk twice before noon asking if I needed anything. A partner I'd never spoken to directly before invited me to lunch. "Big week," he said vaguely, as if he knew something I didn't or suspected. At exactly 2:15 p.m. I left the office. No one asked where I was going. No one stopped me. The briefing room downtown was quiet and secure. When I entered, the room stood. That never happened to me before. Men and women in tailored suits nodded respectfully as I took my seat. We spoke for over an hour about oversight, about internal audits, about reports that had stalled quietly for years. Names were mentioned, powerful names. When the meeting ended, the city attorney leaned toward me. "We're glad you agreed to step in," she said. "This won't stay quiet for long." I nodded. "I know." That evening, I returned home just before dusk. The same street, the same houses. But the air felt unsettled. Two unmarked cars were parked discreetly near the entrance of the neighborhood. Not police, something else, something more official. Mrs. Langley stood on her porch again. This time she didn't pretend not to see me. Her smile was thin. "Good evening," she said. "Evening," I replied. She hesitated, then added, "Busy day." "Yes," I said simply. She nodded, as if confirming something to herself. Inside my house, I poured a drink and stood by the window, watching as more cars passed slowly through the neighborhood, not stopping, just observing. By nightfall, whispers had begun. I could feel it. The next day, everything accelerated. A city vehicle pulled up in front of Mrs. Langley's house mid-morning. Another stopped at Mr. Hollis's. Doors opened. Folders were carried inside. I didn't step outside. I didn't need to. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a message. "We're beginning preliminary inquiries today." I typed back one word: proceed. By afternoon, the neighborhood was buzzing with confusion. People stood in driveways pretending to chat while clearly watching who was being visited and who was. I went for a walk. This time, no one looked away. Some nodded stiffly, others smiled too quickly. Mrs. Langley crossed the street to avoid me. I noticed. That evening, there was another knock on my door. I opened it. Mrs. Langley stood there, hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I wanted to apologize," she said, rushing the words as if afraid I might close the door. "About everything." I studied her face. It wasn't remorse, it was fear. "I didn't realize," she continued. "We didn't realize. If we had known." I stopped her with a raised hand. "Known what?" I asked calmly. She swallowed. "Well, who you are." There it was. "I am exactly who I was last week," I said. "You just see me differently now." She nodded rapidly. "I hope we can move past this." I considered her for a moment. "We'll see," I said. I closed the door gently. That night, the local news aired a brief segment. Sources confirmed that an internal city review has been launched following multiple reports of misuse of emergency services and discriminatory complaints in an upscale suburban neighborhood. No names yet, but they would come. My phone buzzed nonstop: calls, messages, voicemails. People who had never spoken to me before wanted to connect. I ignored them all. This wasn't about attention, it was about accountability. Late that night, I stood on my porch again. The street was quiet, no police cars, no flashing lights, just silence. But it wasn't the same silence as before. This one was nervous. Because the neighborhood had finally learned something. Power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it listens, sometimes it waits, and sometimes it remembers who called the police on a man for taking out his trash. By Monday morning, the neighborhood had changed, though nothing about the houses had. The lawns were still perfectly trimmed, the driveways still spotless, but the air felt heavy, almost electric, charged with whispers and sideways glances. I stepped out for my morning run, tying my sneakers with deliberate calm. I could feel every pair of eyes on me, not the polite, dismissive eyes of before. These were the eyes of people who had underestimated me and were beginning to realize it. Mrs. Langley was the first to see me. Her hands froze mid-prune, the head she had been clipping untouched. She opened her mouth, closed it again, and then turned stiffly, walking inside without a word. The same played out across the street. Windows shuttered, cars slowed, drivers pretended to adjust mirrors, check tires, anything to avoid meeting my gaze. I smiled faintly. Power, I thought, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it walks quietly down the street. By noon, the city's public affairs office confirmed what I already knew. An official investigation into repeated false reports and abuse of emergency services had been launched. And this time it wasn't just a warning, it carried weight. Soon after, I received a knock on my door. Two uniformed officers stood there, badges gleaming, clipboards in hand, not arresting me, no questions about that night. Instead, they had paperwork for the neighbors. Notices to comply, warnings for misuse, official documentation that would leave marks in every file. I took the papers from them, thanking them quietly. Their presence was enough. I didn't need to gloat. The system was already doing that for me. By late afternoon, the whispers had turned to murmurs and murmurs into murmurs that made it back to Mrs. Langley's ears. I watched her through the window as she read letters, her hands trembling slightly. Mr. Hollies clutched his briefcase, muttering under his breath. They had no idea what was coming next, and that was the beautiful part. They had assumed they were untouchable, insulated by wealth and appearances, that they could wield power over me because I was black, because I was polite, because I didn't scream or threaten, because they thought my silence was weakness. By Friday, it was all over the neighborhood grapevine. The internal review had escalated. Multiple complaints against Mrs. Langley, Mr. Hollies, and a handful of others were logged. Reprimands were pending. Even the HOA had been forced to revise procedures, implementing oversight they had ignored for years. I walked down the street in the late afternoon sun. Neighbors scurried indoors at the sight of me. Children whispered to their parents. Doors clicked shut. I stopped at the mailbox, leaning casually, smiling as I held the day's letters. One was addressed to me in bold print, official confirmation of compliance notice to HOA members. I slipped it into my bag, everything had changed, and yet nothing about me had. That night I sat at my kitchen table, the room quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. I poured a glass of wine and smiled faintly at my reflection in the window. I thought of the humiliation I had endured, the disbelief, the fear, the feeling of being small in my own home, and now it was reversed. Not violently, not vindictively, but firmly, unmistakably. The world had shifted slightly, imperceptibly, but irrevocably. I hadn't needed to scream, I hadn't needed to fight, I hadn't even needed to ask for it. I had only needed to exist, to refuse to vanish, to remind them who I really was. By the end of the week, the neighbors avoided the subject entirely. Social gatherings were quieter, compliments came across as forced, smiles didn't reach eyes. And I walked my streets differently, taller, louder in the sense that I was seen, recognized, unignorable. I hadn't changed who I was, but the world around me had. It was the perfect kind of justice. Because sometimes the most powerful revenge is not anger, it is presence, presence that cannot be ignored, presence that quietly, inexorably changes everything. That night I sat in my living room and watched the streetlights flicker on. I thought of my father who had taught me to control my body when the world refused to control itself. I thought of my mother who had told me to always remember my worth no matter what anyone said, and I thought of myself, the man who had been underestimated, humiliated, questioned, dismissed, and now finally recognized. The truth had a way of arriving quietly. It didn't scream, it didn't demand attention, it simply existed. And in the end, it was stronger than fear. Stronger than lies, stronger than privilege. The following week, the neighborhood felt different, though nothing had changed about the houses themselves. Lawns were still immaculate, driveways still gleamed, but the atmosphere had shifted. This time it wasn't tension, it was acknowledgement, subtle, quiet, but undeniable. I stepped outside for my morning run and noticed something new. A few neighbors were standing outside, waiting, not to gawk, not to judge, but to speak. Mrs. Langley approached first. Her hands were no longer trembling, but her face was lined with the weight of realization. I wanted to apologize, she said softly, about everything. I studied her carefully. This wasn't a performance, it was genuine. I heard about the investigation, she continued. We had no idea who we were dealing with or what we were wrongfully doing. I nodded once calmly. Acknowledgement is the first step. Mr. Holly stepped forward as well, his posture stiff. We overstepped. We see that now. I felt no anger, no need to retaliate. They had already learned their lesson. The city's oversight, the official records, and their own fear had done that for me. By mid-morning, the local newspaper ran a story front page. Suburban homeowner exposes misuse of emergency services in neighborhood, prompts HOA reforms. My phone buzzed relentlessly, messages from colleagues, neighbors, even local officials I had never met before. It was overwhelming. But for once, it wasn't threatening, it was recognition. Later that afternoon, a group of neighbors, those who had humiliated me, those who had remained silent, even those who had spread rumors, approached my house. I didn't meet them at the door immediately. I watched from inside, arms crossed, waiting to see what they would do. Mrs. Langley stepped forward first. "We want to make things right," she said. "Is there anything we can do?" I took a slow breath. "Yes," I said finally. Treat every person with the respect you assume they don't deserve. That's how you start. They nodded, humbled, not all at once, not perfectly, but they understood. That evening, I walked down my street without a single glance of judgment following me. The streetlights flickered on over-polished sidewalks, and for the first time I felt safe, not because the world had changed entirely, but because I had refused to vanish, refused to apologize for existing. Refused to be silent while the truth of my life was misrepresented. Power isn't always about money. It isn't always about position. Sometimes it's quiet, relentless, and unapologetic presence. I returned home, unlocking the door slowly. Inside, everything was as I left it, still, silent, safe. I poured a drink and sat by the window, watching the street below. I thought about my father, my mother. Their words echoing in my head: "You are worthy, you are strong, you do not disappear." And I hadn't. By nightfall, I realized that the humiliation, the fear, the judgment, they were all gone, replaced by something far more powerful: respect, not forced, not out of fear, but earned. I sat quietly in the living room, listening to the subtle sounds of the neighborhood settling into a new rhythm. Somewhere outside, children laughed, a dog barked, cars rolled past without a care, and I smiled, because sometimes the world doesn't give you justice immediately. Sometimes it waits for you to stand firm, for you to persist, for you to refuse to be erased. And when it arrives quietly, without fanfare, but with the weight of every lesson learned, every wrong corrected, every truth revealed. I raised my glass in a silent toast, to the boy who once had to hide, to the man who refused to vanish, to the life that no one else could take from me. And for the first time in a long time, I felt free.